They never imagined everything would change that night. As the wind tore through the skies and sirens pierced the silence, two lives, separated by time, pain, and choices, were thrown back together. By fate, by chaos, or perhaps by a miracle in a town ravaged by a tornado. Where houses collapsed and hearts closed off, something unexpected bloomed. A second chance. This is the story of Susan and George, and how, in the midst of destruction, love found a way. Not every story that seems perfect in the beginning ends easily, but some are built on faith, and that changes everything. The morning air in Bristol, Vermont, was filled with the scent of pine trees dampened by the mists that still gently embraced the rooftops of the houses. Small golden leaves danced with the autumn wind, crossing the quiet streets of that town of less than 4,000 souls, where every face was familiar and every story intertwined with the neighbors. On the most charming corner of the town, just a few steps from the small red brick church led by the always smiling Reverend Collins, lived George and Susan. Their home, surrounded by rose bushes and with large windows that let the morning light paint the walls with golden tones, was a reflection of the calm and steady love the two shared. George and Susan had known each other since childhood. He, 2 years older, always seemed more interested in protecting her than impressing her. At 15, Susan began to notice that tall friend with broad smiles and a gentle voice made her heart race. When they finally started dating, it was as if the whole town celebrated. Both families, traditional and highly respected in Bristol, were filled with joy at the union. It was the kind of relationship you'd find in the old books of the town library, pure, patient, and full of silent promises. Every Sunday, without fail, there they were, sitting in the third pew of the church, holding hands, smiling at Reverend Collins, who, even at 70, still climbed the altar steps with contagious energy. George and Susan didn't just listen to the sermons, they lived the teachings. They volunteered in social projects, helped renovate homes, distributed food, and participated in donation drives with a generosity that charmed everyone. 10 years passed this way, between smiles during picnics at the Central Park, stolen kisses after church services, and walks under the snow during the coldest Christmases. The wedding, as expected, was a true community celebration. The church was too small for so many people. White flowers decorated every pew, and the sun that day seemed to shine just for the two of them. George, imposing with his 6 feet 5 inches, couldn't hide his tears upon seeing Susan walking toward him in a simple dress. Yet of an almost celestial delicacy, the honeymoon was in Chicago. George, a basketball fanatic, fulfilled a lifelong dream by attending a Chicago Bulls game. At his side, Susan shared his enthusiasm, even without understanding all the rules. She felt even more in love watching his eyes light up like a child's. They took boat rides on Lake Michigan, walked hand in hand down the magnificent mile, and laughed a lot during dinners in charming restaurants. But nothing topped, for George, the moment the United Center erupted in applause, and he held his wife's hand as if he were holding the whole world. Upon returning to Bristol, they settled into a house near the church, on a tree-lined street where neighbors greeted each other by name and left pies on one another's porches. Married life was calm, full of small acts of affection, breakfasts with loving notes, old movie nights, candlelit dinners, even without a special occasion. 5 years went by, and the desire to grow the family became strong. George dreamed of teaching his son or daughter everything about basketball. Susan, on her part, already imagined telling bedtime stories while rocking a baby in the room. They had started preparing with such care. But the months passed, and then an entire year, no sign. Susan sought medical help and heard reassuring words. Everything's fine, just wait. And they waited. 2 years later, hope finally arrived in the form of 2 pink lines on a pregnancy test. Susan cried. George fell to his knees, silently, but the happiness didn't last long. At 3 months, Susan lost the baby. It was as if the whole world had turned gray. Autumn seemed colder, the sun more distant. Susan didn't leave the bed for weeks. George, even devastated, tried to smile for her, brought hot soup, read Bible verses in a soft voice, as if his voice could keep hope alive. 6 months later, a new pregnancy, a new breath of hope. And again, at 3 months, the cruel silence. Susan began blaming herself. She drifted away from George silently, as if he deserved someone who could give him. A child, George, for his part, only wanted her close. He hugged her every night tightly, as if he could protect her from herself, from the unjust guilt in her eyes. That's when Susan decided to seek a specialist in Burlington. A series of exams, consultations, heavy silences in waiting rooms. Until the diagnosis came, a problem with the placenta. With treatment, there was hope. Without it, every new attempt would be a promise broken before its time. Susan held the paper with the diagnosis in her trembling hands. George was at her side, and in that moment, he said nothing. He just took her hand and led her to the bench. At the little square in front of the clinic, they sat in silence. The sun was slowly setting, coloring the sky in pink and gold, and Susan's eyes filled with tears that finally fell. "I don't want you to see me as a mistake, George." He looked at her tenderly, eyes filled with tears. "I see you as my home. And if I have to go through this pain 1,000 times to live by your side, I will. Because more than a child, I want you." Susan rested her head on his shoulder. The wind carried the scent of dry leaves and whispered promises. And even with their hearts still wounded, in that moment, they knew their love was still greater than any pain. The sound of a heartbeat, not one, but two. Susan held tightly to George's hand as the image on the monitor showed 2 little miracles. The doctor smiled and, with a sparkle in his eyes, said, "Congratulations, it's twins. 2 boys." The world seemed to stop for a second. George covered his mouth with his hand, trying to hold back the tears, but it was in vain. His eyes sparkled as if he were seeing the sky open. He knelt right there in the ultrasound room, kissing Susan's belly with reverence. 2 boys. My God, 2 boys. He whispered with a choked voice. "Thank you, Lord." Susan laughed, still with tears in her eyes. "They already have the most." Emotional dad in the world. She followed every step of the treatment with discipline. 1 year later, hope was reborn in double. The pregnancy went like a dream. No complications, no scares. Susan was spoiled by everyone, friends, neighbors, church members. She couldn't carry a single bag without someone showing up at her side, ready to help. Reverend Collins, with his usual tenderness, decided to celebrate with a community party at the church. A new life is always a reason for praise. But 2? Oh, we're going to make the bells ring with even more joy. He announced before the congregation with a smile from ear to ear. The party was lit by lanterns hanging from the trees in the churchyard, dancing in the gentle breeze of a golden afternoon. Children ran with balloons, ladies offered pies, and cold lemonade, and the soft music of a violin filled the air with lightness. Susan, in a light yellow dress that hugged her belly as if embracing motherhood, smiled with every kindness, every blessing received. "We have already chosen the names," said George proudly, surrounded by friends. "They'll be Michael and Jordan." People laughed, some clapped. It was obvious that George, a basketball fanatic, had won that choice with charm and passion. Susan just shrugged, laughing. "If I have to hear Space Jam one more time, you'll know who really rules that house." The baby's room took shape like a painting made with love. The walls were painted in soft shades of blue and gray, with white clouds hand-painted by Susan. George assembled the cribs with the precision of an architect and the tenderness of an enchanted father. Tiny clothes filled the drawers, teddy bears watched over the corners, and the promise of new life lingered in the air like perfume. Then came the invitation. Jonah's wedding, Susan's cousin and best friend. It would be in 3 weeks, in Nashua, New Hampshire, 3 hours by car from Bristol. "I need to be with her on that day," George said Susan one night, sitting on the porch with her feet resting on a pillow. The sun was setting behind the trees, painting the sky in shades of lavender and coral. "Honey, you'll be 7 months pregnant. It's a long trip. And, the road, I feel great. My pregnancy has been smooth. You yourself said you've never seen me this. Strong. George crossed his arms, looking at the horizon with worry. The wind gently tousled his slightly curly hair as the sky slowly darkened. I don't want to take any risks. Susan, not even small ones. She touched his face gently. I understand. But Joanna would be devastated if I didn't go. And I need to celebrate with her. For me, for us. Everything will be fine, I promise. He sighed, defeated by the light in her eyes. All right, but let's take it easy. No dancing all night, got it? Saturday came with a flawless sky. The sun shone high, spreading a golden light that warmed the skin like a hug. At 8, I meet the suitcases in the trunk and hope in their eyes. George. And Susan set off for Nashua. The road wound through hills and green fields. Susan slept part of the way, her hand resting on her belly while the radio played soft songs. George drove attentively, occasionally casting loving glances at her. Are you okay? He asked softly. Never been better, she replied, smiling. They arrived at the hotel just before 11 and Susan went straight to meet Joanna at the beauty salon. The two hugged like sisters separated by time. Look at you. My God, you're even more beautiful pregnant, Joanna exclaimed, holding her hands. The wedding started right at 6 p.m. under the glow of the early evening. The church was decorated with white and lavender flowers. The air was fresh, with a light scent of jasmine. Susan sat in the front rows, eyes teary as she watched Joanna walk down the aisle. It was a dream scene. Sunset light pouring through the windows, sincere smiles. Eternal promises whispered through tears. The reception afterward was vibrant, with abundant tables, contagious laughter, and music that made the heart dance. But at 10 p.m., as agreed, George held Susan's hand and led her back to the hotel. In the room, she lay down slowly, her eyes heavy with exhaustion and happiness. It was perfect, she murmured. George lay beside her, caressing her hair, and tomorrow we head back home. 3 hearts traveling together, Susan smiled, her eyes slowly closing. Michael and Jordan are already good travel companions. Outside, the moon shone in the clear sky, casting its silvery light over the sleeping city. And in that silent room, where 3 lives were preparing for a new dawn, everything seemed to be exactly where it should be. Everything seemed calm, until the wind began to scream. It was 3 in the morning when George woke up to the sound of something slamming against the window. His heart racing, eyes wide open, he jumped out of bed. The curtains trembled like flags at war, and outside, the sky was furious lightning streaked across the horizon, revealing for brief moments a city shrouded in darkness and chaos. Wearing only sweatpants, George rushed down to the hotel lobby. The air outside smelled of wet earth and fear. The automatic doors fought against the wind, which howled like cries of anguish. What's happening? He asked breathlessly to the receptionist, a middle-aged woman with a worried look. A tornado, she replied, voice shaking. The city was caught by surprise. The alert just came in, but it's going to get worse in the next few hours. George said nothing. He turned and ran back to the room. Upon entering, he found Susan awake, sitting on the edge of the bed with her face in her hands. The wind's noise was deafening, the windows vibrating as if they were about to shatter. What's happening? George? She asked, voice cracking. He approached her, kneeling in front of her and holding her hands. A tornado? But we'll be fine. I'm here. With you. The two of them sat in silence for several minutes, just listening to the wind's lament, as if nature itself was mourning something yet to come. At 6 in the morning, while the storm's gray light crept through the curtains. Cracks, Susan began to writhe in pain. A scream tore from her throat, dry and raw. George, it hurts. It's the contractions. He jumped up, stumbling as if the floor had vanished beneath his feet. Tried to stay calm, but his fingers trembled as he grabbed his phone. He called an ambulance, but the voice on the other end was cold. Due to the high number of calls, The wait time will be longer than usual. Time seemed to stretch cruelly. Until finally, after long minutes of tension, an ambulance with flashing lights arrived, carving its way through streets littered with branches and debris. George held Susan by the waist, trying to shield her from the wind that pushed them back like invisible hands of a cruel fate. At the hospital, everything was orchestrated chaos. Nurses rushed down the halls, doctors wore tense expressions, and alarms blared here and there like bells of despair. Susan moaned in pain on the gurney, sweat dripping down her pale face. A young doctor with steady eyes burst in. "We need to perform an emergency C-section," he said bluntly, looking at George, "or we'll lose her and the babies." The operating room was prepared in haste. George, hands clasped, paced the corridor. The clock on the wall seemed to mock him with its slow hands. Then, just as the scalpels touched Susan's skin, the storm showed its cruelest face. A crash, a flash, and everything went dark. The power poles had collapsed under the tornado's force. The hospital was plunged into darkness. Only a few emergency lights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The cries of patients mixed with the hurried footsteps of nurses trying to keep order. The generators failed. Fear took over, but inside the operating room, a silent battle raged on. Emergency flashlights in the hands of the professionals guided precise incisions. And then a cry, a fragile yet powerful sound. The babies were born, alive. A nurse rushed to George, her face sweaty and scrub stained. "They're born. They're okay." He dropped to his knees, tears flowing uncontrollably. Joy, however fragile, overtook him for a few seconds. But fate still held a cruel card. 10 minutes later, one of the baby's cries stopped abruptly. An alarm blared. The pediatrician ran with the infant in his arms. A whole team mobilized, trying to reverse the inevitable. Chest compressions, respiration, injections. Nothing worked. An hour later, silence won. George was called again. The doctor looked into his eyes, and no words were needed. "No. No," he repeated, voice breaking, stumbling back as if he'd been punched in the chest. He screamed, cursed, kicked chairs, threw a bench at the wall. The man who had always been calm and centered was now a storm of pain. Nurses tried to restrain him. A sedative was administered. He collapsed into one of their arms, sobbing like a child. The night dragged on, through blackouts and rush. People lost in the halls. Pain walking alongside everyone. When the clock struck 1 in the afternoon, the wind finally stopped. The tornado was gone, but the darkness inside George remained. He woke up still sedated, face swollen from crying. He called a nurse. Was it real? He whispered, almost inaudible. "Yes," she replied softly, eyes brimming. He didn't scream, didn't break anything. He just cried, silently, as if he had dried up inside. "Do you want to see Susan or the baby?" she asked. "I want to see my son," he said, without raising his eyes. The nurse led him to the nursery. There, under a yellowish light, was the baby, small, fragile, beautiful. George touched the glass with trembling fingers. Tears fell effortlessly. It was love and pain in the same gesture. Hours later, Susan awoke. "Where's my son?" she asked, still groggy. The nurse hesitated, took a deep breath. One of them didn't make it. Susan's eyes widened. She sat up in bed, clutching the sheets tightly. No, he was fine. "I saw him born, he was fine." She screamed, cried, struggled. Nurses tried to calm her, but there was no comfort. It was a pain that slashed the soul. "And George? Where is he?" she asked, voice choked. "He went back to the hotel. He left me here, alone." Susan sank into the bed, her eyes lost on the ceiling. The silence inside her was deafening. The man who had always been by her side was now distant in the most fragile moment of their lives. At the hotel, George stared at the wall. The storm had passed, but guilt was a hurricane that wouldn't ease. He thought of Susan, of his son. A faint dot, and he murmured, with anger and sorrow, "We shouldn't have come to this damn wedding." The dim light of sunset filtered through the hospital windows when, finally, the power was restored. It was 6 p.m. Outside, the sky held shades of copper and violet, while the scent of wet earth still lingered in the air, a reminder of the storm. That had passed a perfect metaphor for what was also slowly dissipating inside. Susan. The firefighters walked away with heavy steps as the nurse adjusted the cables and monitors beside the bed. Susan, still pale and exhausted, turned with difficulty, her eyes moist with fatigue, and asked in a weak voice, Can you call George? He needs to know I'll be under observation for 2 more days." Her voice faltered almost. Swallowed by the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor, a few hours later, the door opened. George walked in, but he was not the same man. His hardened expression contrasted with the warmth of the room lit by the amber glow of the evening. His eyes, once full of tenderness, now seemed to hide storms. Susan smelled it before he even spoke a word. Alcohol. Strong, pungent dot, it hit her like an invisible slap. George? The man who always preached Christian values? Who would never touch alcohol? She shut her eyes for a moment, trying to hold back the avalanche within. George, her voice trembled, caught between disbelief and pain. Why did you leave me there, alone? Why did you walk away without even looking me in the eye? What happened to us was a tragedy, but our son is still here. He needs us. Silence. George stood still, hands in the pockets of his coat, his gaze distant as if he were looking through her, as if he were in another time, another place. He said nothing because if he did, he might not be able to stop Dot at that moment. The nurse entered with a gentle smile, holding a small bundle of love. Jordan. Susan opened her arms carefully, tears spilling over as she saw her son's little face. The nurse, sensing the tense atmosphere, approached George. Would you like to hold him, sir? He simply nodded, a barely noticeable gesture. When he took the baby in his arms, his shoulders trembled. The world crumbled right there, silently. Between him and his son, his eyes filled with tears. I will never let anything bad happen to you, he murmured. His voice choked, almost a whisper. I'll always be here, my son. Always. Susan watched him, her heart torn between pain and hope. That moment, so delicate, should have been a relief. And it was, but not enough to heal the coldness George still showed her. The following 2 days echoed the first. George visited Jordan, cared for him with attention and tenderness, but treated Susan with a cutting, almost cruel coldness. On the day of discharge, the Bristol sky was covered in thick clouds. The air was cold and damp, as if the very weather reflected the state of their relationship. Inside the car, the silence was dense. George finally broke it. Let's just talk about the essentials. I don't want to say anything that could hurt you more than we're already hurting. Susan simply nodded, feeling her world collapse once again. Arriving in Bristol, George dropped her off at her parents' house. You and Jordan need care, he said, avoiding her gaze. One, I'm not in the right condition. I still can't. She wanted to protest, to say she needed him, that she should be by his side. But the pain in her chest was as heavy as George's. She just nodded again. For a month, Susan stayed there. And George, he came every day to see the baby. But he didn't say a single word to her. Not even a glance. He simply ignored her presence as one avoids an open wound. When she returned home, Susan carried Jordan in her arms, as if carrying her very soul. Upon entering the room, the air grew thin. Everything was exactly as before. 2 little cribs, side by side, matching clothes lovingly folded. Small details with embroidered names, Michael and Jordan. But now, one crib was empty. She broke down. Fell to her knees, holding the son who survived, silently mourning the son who was gone. Later, noticing that George had moved his things to the guest room, she called him to talk. George, what's happening to you? You've completely withdrawn from me. You only speak when absolutely necessary. You didn't help with Jordan like we agreed. You left me at my parents' house, and now this?" He looked at her fixedly. His face was somber and his eyes as dull as fogged glass. "You really want to know?" He said firmly, "Fine, it's your fault. If you hadn't insisted on that trip, Michael would still be here. You wanted to go, even knowing the risk. You only thought of yourself. That's absurd," she replied, heart shattered. "How can you blame me for something out of our control? A tornado, George, a tornado. If we hadn't gone, there wouldn't have been a tornado." He shouted, "You know that..." "That's not fair," she whispered, eyes filled with tears. "I thought you were the one person who could never hurt me, but you did worse, Daw, and just like that." A crack opened, deep and cruel, between them. The following months were a silent void. George loved his son, cared for him devotedly, but with Susan, it was as if an invisible wall stood between them. He smiled only a few times and always at Jordan. The rest of the time, he lived withdrawn, silent, staring into nothingness. He never returned to church, even with visits from Reverend Collins, who listened without judgment. George kept his distance. Susan continued to attend services alone, keeping the flame of faith alive that now seemed extinguished inside her husband. Soon, Susan realized something worse was happening. George was drinking. Every night, he went alone to a local bar and came back drunk, with unsteady steps and lost eyes. She suggested therapy, spoke with love, tried to rescue the man she had fallen in love with. But 1 year after Jordan's birth, he simply said, "I want a divorce." Susan froze. "It doesn't make sense anymore." He continued, his voice hollow, "But I'll live nearby. I'll always be there for Jordan." She cried, "A lot. I don't accept it, but I respect it. And I'll be here if one day you need me." For a brief moment, George trembled. Susan's generosity struck him like a silent lightning bolt, but the pain was still stronger than any memory of love, and he left. The rain was just beginning to fall in Bristol. Gentle drops tapped against the window panes of Susan's house like whispers from the past. Inside, the warmth of the kitchen clashed with the chill of her thoughts. The memory of George moving. I had long since settled. Yet something about the empty chair at the table still echoed with his absence. George had moved just 3 blocks away, to a small house on the corner. It was close enough to see Jordan often, but far enough to leave space between them. Time passed, and the pain dulled but never vanished. Some years after George's move, Susan began to feel something different, as if the house carried a presence that wasn't Jordan's. A strange warmth in the hallway, a fleeting shadow in the corner of her eye, a childlike energy, a feeling she couldn't quite explain. She would tell herself, "It must be in my head," but part of her whispered, "No, I feel it. I feel the love of my child, even if he's not here with me." One morning, George came by to pick up Jordan and take him to school. The sound of the front door closing echoed through the quiet house. Susan was alone again, as she climbed the stairs to tidy Jordan's room. The sensation returned stronger than ever. A shiver, like the brush of invisible fingers down her spine. She stopped halfway up, her hand gripping the wooden banister. "It can't be," she whispered. "Yes, it can. I feel him. I really feel him. Years passed." Jordan turned 6. George, eager to introduce him to basketball, despite not being much good at it himself, enrolled him in a school where children were encouraged to start the sport. From an early age, it was there that Jordan met Henry. Henry was the same age and had just moved to the city. Coincidentally, he now lived right next door to Susan and Jordan with Mr. and Mrs. Smith, his grandparents. From the very first week, the 2 boys became inseparable. Henry was a sweet, gentle soul. His kindness was natural, disarming. He had moved to Bristol after losing both his parents in a tragic car accident. With no siblings, his grandparents had taken him in and brought him to this new town to start over. Every afternoon after school, Jordan and Henry would head to Henry's backyard, where his grandparents had built a small basketball court just for him. The boys laughed and played for hours, their sneakers echoing on the pavement like music in the breeze. On Sundays, they attended Reverend Collins's church together, two small figures seated side by side in the wooden pews, heads bowed in prayer. Hearts light with innocence, Henry began spending more and more time at Susan's house. Susan adored him. Watching the two boys together was like watching the sun and moon play in the same sky. There was something magical about them, something healing. But sometimes when Susan watched them laughing in the living room or sharing snacks at the table, her eyes filled with tears. A shadow would pass across her face, and her heart would ache. She couldn't help but think of the child she had lost. The child who might have been there too. One quiet afternoon, lost in her thoughts, she whispered to herself, maybe George was right all along. Unable to carry the weight alone, Susan went to visit Reverend Collins. The old church smelled of aged wood and rain-soaked stone. She sat across from him, her voice trembling. "Reverend," she began, "was it my fault? What can I do to lift this weight from my heart? So many years have passed, and I still feel the same pain." Reverend Collins looked at her with kind, weathered eyes. "Asterisk, my child, we do not know God's plans for our lives. But everything, absolutely everything, happens for our greater good. You may not understand it now, but speak to God. Feel His love for you, and all those dark feelings will begin to fade." Susan nodded, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. As she stood to leave, she paused at the door. "Reverend, can we feel the presence of someone who is no longer here?" He smiled softly. "Asterisk, my child, nothing is impossible, if you believe it is possible." She smiled back, a fragile but genuine smile, and walked away. Later that evening, Susan was in the kitchen preparing dinner. The comforting aroma of roasted vegetables and warm bread filled the air. And then, again that feeling, but this time it wasn't strange. It was comforting. A wave of love washed over her, no fear. Just warmth. She paused, hand on her chest, eyes misty. "Wherever you are, my child, know that I love you with all my heart. Always." Just then, the front door opened. George entered with Jordan and Henry, both boys laughing, cheeks flushed from the cold. Mr. and Mrs. Smith had a commitment at church and had asked if Henry could stay for dinner. At 9 p.m. The Smiths returned to pick Henry up. In the hallway, as coats were gathered and goodbyes were said, Mr. and Mrs. Smith shared more about Henry's past. They spoke of the accident, the heartbreak, and how his parents had lived in the city of Nashua. Susan froze. Nashua. Upon hearing the name of the city, Susan felt as if the ground trembled slightly beneath her feet. Her face paled. Her eyes filled with tears. "It was there," she murmured. "It was there that ... That everything happened to me too." A heavy silence fell between the four. Mr. Smith placed his hand on Susan's shoulder in a gesture of deep empathy. Perhaps our paths crossed for a greater reason," he said, his voice choked. Susan nodded, her eyes still watery. Henry said goodbye to Jordan with a tight hug. And before leaving, he looked at Susan and smiled in a way that made her heart race, as if he knew something she still didn't understand. And in that moment, she felt it. For sure, he was there too. In Henry's presence, in the affection between the boys, in the scent of jasmine coming through the window. Her other son, invisible to the eyes, but alive in love. The sound of an ambulance siren piercing the air would have been less impactful than Henry's muffled scream that late afternoon. It was an ordinary morning. The sun shone with a soft light, the sky was clear, and a fresh breeze announced another spring day. George, as he did every day, stopped in front of Susan's house to pick up Jordan and take him to school. The boy got into the car with his usual smile, excited about something he didn't immediately reveal. During the drive, he spoke casually. "Dad, after class today, I'm going with Henry to check out a basketball court nearby. Can you pick me up a little later?" George frowned, suspicious. "What court, Jordan?" "That abandoned one." Yeah, Dad, but it's fine. We're just going to play a little. George sighed. Looking in the rearview mirror, I don't know. That place has been neglected for years. It could be dangerous. Please, Dad. We're only going for a little while. I promise I'll be careful. Faced with his son's insistence, Andrew rushed to answer a business call. George gave in against his better judgment. School ended and, as planned, Jordan and Henry left through the back, heading toward the old court. The place was surrounded by tall grass, the ground cracked and full of whole scars of time and abandonment. But in the boys' eyes, it was a space for fun, for freedom. Let's see who makes more three-pointers, shouted Jordan, smiling, as he ran with the ball in his hands. But what was supposed to be an afternoon of laughter turned into a nightmare. With one miscalculated step, Jordan tripped over a hole hidden by dry leaves. His body crashed hard against a twisted iron bar jutting from the broken concrete. A dry scream escaped his lips before he passed out. The iron had pierced his leg, hitting an artery. Henry ran to him, knelt by his friend, and upon seeing the blood gushing in a terrifying amount, he panicked Jordan. Someone help! Help, please! The desperate voice echoed through the neighborhood. A slowly passing car stopped upon hearing the screams. It was Mr. James, Reverend Collins' assistant. As he approached and saw the scene, his face went pale. My God, it's Jordan and Henry. I know them from church. Without thinking twice, he grabbed his phone, called emergency services, and carefully placed the boys in his car. Within minutes, they arrived at the hospital. Jordan was taken straight to the emergency room. Mr. James called George, who answered with a carefree voice. George, it's urgent. Jordan had an accident. I'm with him at the hospital. The words hit like a punch. George hung up and ran. On the way, he called Susan. In less than 20 minutes, they were both at the hospital. Susan arrived in tears, her face pale and body trembling. George held back his tears, trying to stay strong. Mr. James tried to calm them, but the desperation was overwhelming. They shouldn't have been there. It's too dangerous. There's broken glass, holes, scattered iron bars. I've always told the Reverend. That court is a trap. Mr. James' words were like a blade to George's heart. Regret crashed over him like a storm. It was me, he murmured. Jordan asked me and I let him go. I didn't listen carefully. I was on a business call. Susan looked at him, eyes full of tears. But gentle George, don't blame yourself. It wasn't your fault. Everything has a reason. Now we need to focus on our son's recovery. Those words sank deep. How could she still be so generous? George lowered his head, filled with shame. He thought of all the years he blamed Susan for Michael's death. All the pain, the distance, the harsh words, and there she was, comforting him. She who had every reason to point fingers, to retaliate. But she didn't. She's better than I've ever been, George thought, a tightness in his chest. 10 minutes passed. The doctor entered the room, his expression grave. I need to be direct. Jordan lost a lot of blood. We need an immediate transfusion, but his blood type is extremely rare. There are no compatible units in nearby cities. We must act fast. Call everyone you know to get tested. Susan jumped to her feet. She called Reverend Collins, who immediately mobilized the entire church community. Within minutes, dozens of people began arriving at the hospital, but the hours passed. 1, 2, 3, nothing. No matches. Desperation took over. Susan sat with her face buried in her hands, silently sobbing. George paced back and forth, eyes red, muttering broken prayers. Outside, night began to fall. The hospital lights glowed a pale yellow, contrasting with the growing darkness. The breeze that was once gentle now felt cold, cutting like the fear that gripped everyone's hearts. And yet, amid that unbearable pain, something began to shift in the silence between Susan and George. A bridge was being rebuilt, made of tears, regret, and a love that, though wounded, had never ceased to exist. The rain lashed against the windows of the hospital like an echo of the turmoil in their hearts. It was late, well past visiting hours, but Henry remained in the waiting room, his small hands clenched tightly in his lap and his eyes fixed on the double doors of the emergency wing. The fluorescent lights bathed everything in a sterile, bluish hue, but in Henry's heart, a fire of urgency burned brighter than ever. When his grandparents, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, finally arrived to pick him up, Henry stood up but didn't move toward them. "I'm not leaving," he said, voice firm despite the quiver of emotion. "I need to stay here." "Henry, honey, it's late. Jordan's in good hands. Let's go home. Rest." "No." He burst out suddenly and took off running down the corridor. "Henry!" Mrs. Smith called, alarmed. He ran with all the strength his little legs could muster, navigating the cold, echoing halls until he found Dr. Walsh just stepping out of the ICU. "Doctor!" "Doctor!" he called out breathlessly. Asterisk, please, let me donate my blood to my friend. Dr. Walsh looked startled and knelt in front of him. "My boy, you can't donate. You're just a child." "I know, but I feel it. I feel like I can save his life." "Please, let me at least take the test." Dr. Walsh sighed and placed a hand on Henry's shoulder, his eyes filled with compassion and doubt. He looked up and saw Mr. and Mrs. Smith approaching. "He's insistent," Dr. Walsh said softly. "And technically, there's no harm in testing. It's extremely unlikely, but maybe we should let him just so he can feel at peace. We'll need your consent, though." The grandparents looked at each other, visibly torn. Then, seeing the unwavering determination in Henry's eyes, they nodded. "All right." We'll sign. The test was done quickly. They told Henry not to get his hopes up, but he didn't need hope. He had faith. Hours passed. The sterile smell of antiseptic, the soft murmurs of nurses, the clicking of heels on tilet all became background noise until Dr. Walsh returned. Holding a folder with trembling hands, he looked at the family and took a deep breath. "He's compatible." Susan collapsed into a chair, tears welling up. George sat down beside her, stunned. Mrs. Smith clutched her husband's hand. "It's a miracle," Susan whispered. "God's hand is in this." "I feel it." Henry beamed, not with pride, but with a quiet, knowing peace. He was right all along. The donation was made quickly, under strict supervision. Henry was brave, not flinching once. But the danger wasn't over. Jordan still had a metal bar embedded in his leg, and the surgery to remove it would be long and delicate. The operation lasted nearly 5 hours. Outside the operating room, the minutes dragged like centuries. When Dr. Walsh finally came out, everyone stood. "The surgery went well. He's stable. He's being moved to the ICU." Henry sighed in relief, and only after hearing that, agreed to go home with his grandparents. 3 days later, Jordan was transferred from the ICU to a recovery room, though he still needed intense care to avoid infection. When Henry entered the room with Mr. and Mrs. Smith, he paused at the door. The sunlight streaming through the window painted Jordan's pale face in gold. His eyes opened slowly and then widened. "Henry?" Henry ran to the bed, tears streaming down his face, and threw his arms around his best friend. "I love you, Jordan. I love you so much. I knew I could save you because God told me to take the test." Jordan's own eyes filled with tears, and he hugged Henry back, trembling. "I love you too, Henry, and I'm so glad it was you who saved me." Susan sobbed silently, her hands over her mouth. George stood beside her, eyes glossy. Mr. and Mrs. Smith wept, moved beyond words. 15 days after the surgery, Jordan was discharged from the hospital. He would need to rest at home for 2 months. Every single day after school, Henry came to Jordan's house. He sat beside his friend, brought him notes, taught him everything they'd learned in class, and they studied together, laughing, struggling, bonding. Meanwhile, George tried to reconnect with Susan. He brought her coffee, stayed longer when visiting Jordan, but Susan wasn't ready. Not yet. Her heart was still healing from the fear of almost losing her other son. 2 months later, Jordan returned to school, welcomed by classmates with cheers and smiles. Though he couldn't return to basketball for another 6 months, his joy was unmistakable. A year passed since the accident. One sunny afternoon, Mrs. Smith came to pick up Henry from Susan's house. Susan had baked a cake and invited her in for coffee dot as the smell of cinnamon and vanilla filled the kitchen. Susan finally spoke. "You know, I never told you this. The night everything happened. The tornado, the hospital in Nashua. That's the night I lost Michael. The night George and I separated. He blamed me." Mrs. Smith lowered her cup slowly. "Susan, my daughter gave birth to Henry that same night. She went into labor just as the storm hit. They rushed her to the hospital at the same time as you." Susan froze. My God, what a coincidence, Mrs. Smith. That's unbelievable. Days went by. But Susan couldn't stop thinking about it. The Reverend's words came back to her about the divine nature of coincidences. One morning, she turned to George. "I need to go on a trip. I'll be back in 2 days." George, puzzled, asked, "Do you need help? Can I do something for you?" She smiled faintly. "Just take care of Jordan. I'll be back in 2 days." The sky was heavy with gray clouds, and a cold wind swept the city streets like whispers from the past. Susan stood at the door, suitcase in hand, heart pounding as if warning her of what was to come. She looked at George, who, confused, asked, "Okay, but do you need help? Is there anything I can do for you?" Susan gave a faint smile, eyes already distant. "No, just take good care of Jordan. I'll be back in 2 days." She didn't say more. There were no words to explain the whirlwind inside. Her. She was returning to Nashua. That name alone stirred her soul. It was the place where her story had taken a turn so sharp it left her breathless for years. She had never returned. Not even once. But now something inside her pushed her to confront the ghosts of the past. She needed answers. She needed to understand what really happened on that night, the night Jordan was born. Upon arriving in Nashua, Susan booked a room at a small hotel near the hospital where her son had come into the world. The air there was different, dense, as if time hadn't moved. She left her bags in the room and, without resting, headed straight to the hospital. The hospital lobby smelled of disinfectant and memories. Each step echoed on the cold floor, as if the walls whispered secrets. Susan approached the reception, her voice trembling. "I'd like to see my medical record from 7 years ago. The night I gave birth here." The nurse, with a look of slight surprise, typed on the computer and shortly after handed her a folder. Susan sat on one of the plastic chairs and opened the file. Her hands shook slightly. There, written in neat, clinical handwriting, was the saddest night of her life. No new information. Just the pain of reliving what was already burned into her. Memory, what am I doing here? She thought, asterisk, why did I come here to relive all of this? She wiped away a tear and closed the folder. Still, something in her heart said not to give up. She handed the record back to the nurse, thanked her. The nurse noticed Susan's misty eyes and said, in a gentle tone, "If you want to come back tomorrow," the nurse who was on duty that night, "we'll be here. Her name is Emma. Maybe she can help you somehow. I don't know what information you're looking for, but maybe she can help." Susan forced a grateful smile and nodded. "Thank you. I'll think about it." That evening, Susan returned to the hotel, her body tired but her mind restless. She left again, wandering through the streets without a clear destination. The sky was now orange with the sunset, and the air carried the scent of damp earth. She walked for a while until she found a small cafe. She went in and sat at a table by the window, ordered something simple, and let her eyes wander through the glass. Across the street, a small park extended into a square where children laughed and played. The laughter, so pure, cut through her, melancholy like a gentle breeze. Then her gaze froze. 2 twin siblings, about 5 or 6 years old, were playing on the swing. "A boy and a girl!" They laughed in synchrony, as if their souls shared the same joy. Susan's eyes filled with tears. That was the sign she needed. Her heart raced, but this time not with pain hope. She looked up and with a trembling voice whispered, "Thank you, God," for this sign. The next day, the sky was clear, and Susan felt lighter as she walked back to the hospital. She asked for Nurse Emma and waited at the reception for nearly an hour. Then a woman in her 50s, with kind eyes and an empathetic smile, approached. "Mrs. Williams, would you like to speak with me?" Susan stood up, nervous but determined. "Yes, I need to talk about something that happened 7 years ago." Emma looked intrigued. "How can I help?" "To use a long story, can we talk at the cafe here in the hospital?" "Of course," Emma agreed. They sat in a quiet corner of the cafe. The sunlight filtered through the large windows, painting golden streaks on the table. Susan took a deep breath and began to recount everything that had happened the night of Jordan's birth and how she had always felt that something didn't add up, that she was still searching for answers. Emma listened attentively, nodding gently. "We can look at your medical record," she suggested. "I've already seen it, and I didn't find anything different from what I already knew." Emma paused, thoughtful. Then her eyes lit up with an idea. "We can check the records of all the women who gave birth that night, and their children's records too." Susan agreed. It made sense. Emma went off to search through the archives. About 30 minutes later, she returned with a stack of folders. They began looking through them together. That night, 5 women had given birth, but only Susan had twins. They looked at the record of Mrs. Smith's daughter Henry's mother, Jordan's friend, but there was nothing unusual. File after file, nothing jumped out. But Susan wasn't even sure what she was looking for. Just that something deep inside kept pushing her forward. Discouraged, Susan shifted the conversation. "I didn't tell you. Jordan almost died a few weeks ago. He needed an emergency transfusion. His blood type is extremely rare. And by an incredible coincidence, Henry was a match. He saved my son's life." Emma widened her eyes, as if something had just awakened. "What? Henry was a match? That's extremely rare indeed. Wait." She suddenly stood up, grabbed some children's medical records, and began flipping through them urgently. Her fingers trembled slightly. Her eyes scanned each line with precision. "Susan, would you excuse me? I need to check something in the main archive." Of course, Susan watched her walk away with hurried steps. Her heart was now beating far too loudly, as if it already knew that something was about to be revealed. The revelation that changes everything begins in silence. But not just any silence. It was the kind of silence that precedes the storm. The white hospital lights flickered softly, reflecting off the pale walls of the hallway. Outside, dense clouds gathered in the sky, as if the entire universe was breathing in difficulty, waiting for what was about to happen. Emma hurried down the narrow halls of the pediatric wing. Her steps echoed lightly, but there was something unsettling about her face. She held a bundle of medical files in her hands, each sheet a birth story recorded with precision. Or so she thought. She sat down in the small filing room, illuminated by a single lamp on the ceiling. The cold light cast long shadows on the walls, as though the very documents held old secrets. She flipped through one, then another. No anomalies, until she stopped. She stared intently at the name in the upper corner of a file. Henry Smith. She furrowed her brow. Something told her she needed to go further. She pulled the file of Claire Smith, Henry's recorded mother. Her hands started to shake. This doesn't make sense, she murmured to herself. Henry's blood type was AB negative, but Claire's was O positive, and the father, according to the records, was A positive. Biologically, it was impossible. Emma's eyes widened. Without hesitation, she grabbed the file of Jordan's, Susan's son. Her heart seemed to beat in her throat. Jordan's blood type was also AB negative. Emma stood up so abruptly that the chair nearly toppled. She ran through the hallways as though she were carrying a ticking time bomb in her hands. Susan was still in the waiting room when Emma burst in like a whirlwind. The sky outside was now crying thin raindrops, and thunder rumbled in the distance. "Susan, we need to talk, now." Susan stood up startled, her eyes wide. "Did something happen to Jordan?" she asked anxiously. Emma shook her head, but her expression was serious, almost haunted. "No, it's about Henry." The two entered a small room, where the yellowish light created an intimate and tense atmosphere. Emma laid the files on the table. "Susan, there's something here that doesn't add up. Henry doesn't have the same blood type as either his mother or his father." Susan blinked several times, confused. "What do you mean? What are you saying?" Emma took a deep breath, as though preparing to cross a bridge, not knowing if it would hold. "Susan, Henry can't be Miss Claire Smith's son. Biologically, it's impossible. But he has exactly the same blood type as Jordan. And that only happens with twins." The world stopped. Susan felt everything spin. Her breath faltered, her eyes lost focus. And then, without a word, her body gave way. She fainted. The medication room was silent. The low light cast a soft shadow. The rain continued to fall outside, now stronger, as if it were crying along. 20 minutes passed before Susan opened her eyes. Emma was sitting beside her, gently holding her hand. "Tell me I'm not dreaming," Susan whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Emma smiled tenderly, her eyes misty. "No, Susan, you're not dreaming. Henry is your son." Asterisk that night, in the dark and the chaos, one of the nurses must have swapped the babies. Susan brought her hands to her face, tears flowing uncontrollably. "I knew it. I always felt it. Since the day Fathery moved next door, I felt his presence. God, what a gift. What joy. Thank you, God. Thank you for bringing my boy back to me." Still in shock, her heart overflowing, Susan went back home. The sky was already brightening, as if the storm had cleared everything, even her pain. She left her bags on the floor and crossed the garden, covered in wet leaves, to George's house. Inside, Henry and Jordan were laughing as they played basketball on the new video game George had bought for them. Jordan, upon seeing his mother, ran to hug her tightly. "Mom, you're back." Susan hugged him tightly, her tears still falling. Then she looked at Henry, who smiled innocently, unaware that his life was about to change. "Henry, come here, my love." She pulled him into a tight embrace. For a moment, he was confused, but he returned the hug sweetly. George, watching from a distance, furrowed his brow. "Susan, what's going on? Why are you crying?" She stepped away from the boys and called him into the kitchen. "George, we need to talk. It's something extraordinary." As the boys returned to the video game, Susan asked him to make coffee. With trembling hands, she opened her purse and took out the copies of the files. "Look at this." George read silently, and gradually, color drained from his face. "Are you sure about this?" "Absolutely. God has always guided me. I just didn't know where to look." He staggered a little, and Susan helped him, crying with him. "Our son has been by our side all this time, and now he's coming home." They embraced longingly, their tears mixed with both sorrow and joy. The next day, the sun rose, shining brighter than ever. It was as if the world knew that a miracle had occurred. Susan went to the church where Reverend Collins was reading silently. At the altar, the morning light streamed through the stained glass windows, painting the floor with shades of hope. "Reverend, I need your help." She told him everything. The Reverend listened in silence, his eyes brimming with emotion. "My daughter, God does wonderful things. Don't worry. Tomorrow we'll call Mr. and Mrs. Smith and we'll talk calmly. God will guide us." But that night, Susan couldn't sleep. She sat on the edge of the bed, looking out the open window, where the cool breeze carried the fragrance of the flowers in the garden. Her eyes sparkled and her heart beat faster. She smiled silently, her gaze lost in the stars, because now she knew her son was coming home. The sky that Friday afternoon seemed to be holding its breath. Pale clouds hung motionless over the city, while a gentle breeze stirred the leaves of the trees in front of the church. The small parish room attached to the temple received a soft light through the tall windows, filtered by stained glass in shades of blue and gold. Inside, the silence was almost sacred. Reverend Collins adjusted the collar of his cassock and smiled tenderly at the four now settling into the dark wooden chairs, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, Susan, and George. The atmosphere was respectful, thick with expectation, yet wrapped in a serenity that only a spiritual environment could offer. In a low and steady voice, the Reverend opened the conversation. Mr. and Mrs. Smith, Susan and George have something very serious and at the same time profoundly beautiful to share with you today. The Smiths' eyes met for a moment. There was surprise and also a certain stiffness. George, who had been away from the church and the family for so many years, being there was in itself an unexpected event. Their hearts were racing, even though they tried to hide it. Susan then leaned slightly forward. Her trembling hands met on her lap, and her voice came out serene, yet full of emotion. I know it's not easy to remember what happened, what we all went through, but I ask that you listen with open hearts. She told everything: the discovery, the test result, the reunion of the twins separated since birth. And as she spoke, Mrs. Smith's eyes began to fill. Mr. Smith tried to maintain his composure, but his blue eyes, so full of memories, soon let the first tears fall. For a few minutes after the account, silence reigned. The air felt thicker, as if the words spoken were still floating in the room, trying to find their place. It was Mr. Smith who broke the silence, his voice hoarse, almost a whisper. I know God has his plans, and Henry, oh, our Henry, he will always be our dear grandson. He paused, took a deep breath, trying to hold back the tears. What worries me most, for me and my wife, is that we're already old. We don't have anyone else close. Claire didn't have siblings. Her husband didn't either. And many times we ask ourselves, what if something happens to us? Who would take care of our boy? Mrs. Smith held her husband's hand, her tearful eyes fixed on Susan. But now we understand that maybe all of this was God's plan. For Henry's good, so that he could have a full life. With his brother, with you. He then looked at Susan and George with an emotional smile. If you want him to live with his brother, we have no objections. We only ask one thing: that we may continue to see our grandson, that he knows he has another pair of grandparents who love him deeply. Susan couldn't hold back her tears. She got up and went to the Smiths, kneeling before them. You can see him whenever you want. No need to ask, no need to call. Our home is yours always. The doors will be open, and so will our hearts. Mrs. Smith hugged her tightly, as if hugging her own daughter. George moved, just nodded, his eyes misty. Later that same quiet afternoon, Susan drove to her parents' house, where Jordan and Henry were playing in the garden. The sky was starting to clear, and a ray of sunshine lit up the boy's hair. Susan hugged them both, kissed Henry's forehead gently, and took him back to the Smiths' house. It still wasn't time to reveal anything. The next morning arrived like a blessing. A golden Saturday, bright, the sky as clean as a freshly washed sheet. At Susan's house, the breakfast table was carefully set. Fresh fruit, warm bread, corn, cake, and steaming coffee filled the room with a cozy aroma. Henry arrived holding hands with his grandparents. George accompanied them, wearing a light shirt and a calm smile. The boys sat together, still sleepy but giggling. After a brief prayer led by Reverend Collins, they gave thanks to God for life, for food, and for family. Susan cleared her throat softly. Boys, we have something important to tell you. Jordan raised his eyebrows, curious. What is it, Mom? Sounds serious. Mr. Smith spoke first, his voice choked. Then Susan, gently. Finally, George, with his heart on his sleeve, explained to the two boys, in simple and sincere words, the truth that had united those two hearts since birth. Jordan's eyes widened. He looked at Henry, who remained silent for a moment, digesting. Everything. And then, like a dam breaking, Henry shouted, "We're brothers! We're brothers!" He threw himself into Jordan's arms, crying and laughing at the same time. "Grandpa, Grandma, what a gift you gave me. I got another dad and mom. Now I have dad and mom with Jesus in heaven, and also dad and mom here. With me, I'm so happy. And now I have more grandpa and grandma too." Everyone at the table had tears in their eyes. Susan couldn't stop smiling through her tears. George brought his hands to his face. Henry's heart was too big to hold so much gratitude. It simply overflowed. Jordan hugged him back tightly. "I found my brother, and he's right here by my side. He saved me, and now he saved my heart." The boys ran out to the yard. As if life had just begun, the joy was pure. It was whole. Suddenly, they came running back inside and handed out kisses all over the kitchen. George, Susan, Mr. and Mrs. Smith were all targets of tight hugs and spontaneous affection. It was impossible not to cry. Mr. Smith then said, "Let's leave Henry free. He'll decide where he wants to stay. If he wants to live with Jordan, great. If he wants to sleep here from time to time, that's fine. Our doors will always be open, and Jordan is welcome anytime." After breakfast, Mr. and Mrs. Smith returned home. The morning remained warm, light, as if the entire universe were smiling. Susan was gathering the dishes, and George, in silence, approached. His eyes were moist. "Susan," he said in a low, trembling voice, "I need to tell you something." "I've carried for a long time." She stopped, turned around. Her gaze steady and at the same time gentle. "I made you suffer. I left you at the worst moment. I was unfair." And he swallowed hard. "The pain I felt when Jordan had his accident made me understand everything you went through alone." George took a deep breath. "In all these years, I was never with another woman. You were always the one for me. I just wanted that one day, if possible, you could forgive me. Because I haven't even been able to forgive myself." Susan stepped closer. Her eyes were shining. "George, I've already forgiven you a long time ago. But forgiving isn't forgetting." She touched her chest. "It's letting go of a weight from the heart that no longer belongs to me. You're the father of my children, my only husband, and you gave me the greatest gift in my life. Them." She paused, with honest sadness. "But I still can't reconnect the way you want." "I'm sorry, I understand," he said, "and if one day you need me, I'll be close." He left in silence, but hope no longer left him. A year passed. The boys lived between both homes, inseparable. George gave up alcohol, returned to church, and reconnected with the family. Henry now called him Dad. Susan was finally a mother twice over. At the Thanksgiving celebration, organized by Reverend Collins, the church was full. Tables covered in colorful dishes, laughter, hugs, and joy everywhere. George, his heart pounding in his chest, wore a suit and tie. He arrived at Susan's house and invited her to go with him. "You look beautiful, Susan," she smiled. "Thank you, George." "So do you die at the church?" After the prayer, George asked to speak. With a choked voice, he told everyone how God had restored his life and his family. At the end, he paused and then looked at her. "Do you see that woman in the green dress? The kindest and most amazing I've ever met? She is the mother of my children, and today I want to ask." The entire church went silent. All eyes fixed on him. "Susan, will you marry me again?" "Oh." Voices echoed from the pews. Susan, blushing but with sparkling eyes, replied, "Yes, George, I will." Applause echoed through the church walls. Reverend Collins, visibly moved, called them to the front and blessed them once more. "Trust in God. He's always with you. Just open your heart and let him in." And in that moment, among smiles, tears, and embraces, a new story was beginning. Not a rewriting of the past, but the promise of an entire future. Leave a comment below and let us know what you loved most about this beautiful story. We'd love to hear your thoughts. If you believe in soulmates, Did you know that you can discover yours through revealing drawings? This unique technique can transform the way you see your deepest connections. To learn more and uncover this fascinating mystery, click the link in the video description.
Do you love heartwarming love stories that touch your soul? Then subscribe now to our channel, Timeless Love Stories. We post new videos every week, filled with romance, twists, and happy endings that will leave you inspired. Don't miss a single chapter of this magical journey. Click the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell to be alerted whenever a new video is released. Come experience these unforgettable stories with us.